It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Christine Easterfield. She was called into service, I understand, at the last moment to pinch hit for someone who couldn't be here. We have had other speakers from her organization in the past, which is Cambashi, and they've always done a great job of enlightening us as to what is going on in the international market. That wonderful task falls to Christine today, and I'm going to allow her to introduce herself. So please give her a warm welcome, Christine.
Okay, thank you, Joel. So, you can all hear me now. That's great. Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Christine Easterfield. I'm not Peter Thorne. I'm sorry. I think my name made it into some of the materials. But I'm going to speak on an international business update. So to give something of an international flavor to our views on the engineering software business. So why Cambashi? Why are we giving you this view? Well, we've been around for nearly 30 years now, researching and analyzing the engineering software market. We have our offices in Cambridge, is where we're based, and we opened an office in the Boston area in 2008, and we have a worldwide network of associates to give us that feet on the ground access, because there's nothing like knowing what's going on in the local region to help you with your business strategies. I wish I could say the illustration was our offices. It is the other major landmark in Cambridge, which is King's College. We're only up the road from that. We can peep at that anytime we like, though. So what do we do? At Cambashi, we focus on the use of software in the manufacturing and production industries, specifically engineering software. We've always called it technical applications, and I'll probably drop into that phraseology as I'm speaking today. It essentially means the same thing. It's the CAD, CAM, geospatial, PLM kind of software that you call here in this conference here the engineering software. And what we do is we look at why people are investing in this type of software, what different industries are looking at it, the technology issues that type of software addresses, and how you bring together the providers of those solutions to the business problems. And the services we offer manifest themselves on this great Wheel of Fortune here thing. They resolve themselves into three business lines, which is the classic consultancy and advisory services. We have a training arm, which focuses particularly on industry understanding. So as companies are endlessly focusing again on aligning their businesses to understand what different industries are doing, we can help people understand how those industries operate. Because if you don't know what your customers are doing, how can you hope to address the problems that they're facing as well? But the business line that I'm going to be picking up on today is our market observatories. So this is the result of our research and analysis into specifically the use of engineering, engineering software in manufacturing and production industries. So what are our market observatories? Well, we take a look at engineering software from at least 4 different perspectives. So we look at it from different geographies, how those geographies, different countries, split their usage across industries, what types of people in those different industries are using the software. So we look at occupation classes. And we look at the application segments, so the different types of businesses the different types of software that's being used in those industry areas. We also look at what the vendors themselves are using, what you guys are doing, what your revenues are looking like, what sort of areas you're moving into, what product offerings you're providing. And we resolve all of these so that we end up with a very robust, very reliable view of the relative size and shape of the market for this type of software around the world. And that's what gives us this global perspective. Now, I mentioned the consultancy role that we have, and consultants supposedly are the ones who will tell you the way forward. Okay, so which is the way forward? This is a little joke at the expense of someone for whom English probably isn't their first language. But it is valid in many ways, because if you don't know where you're headed, then any way can be the right direction. And I hope maybe I can give you some pointers today as to where you're aiming for. Ooh. So, okay. So this is really what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk a little bit about global strategies. I'm going to look at the technical applications market around the world. I'll take a quick look at how some of the industries are looking in the emerging market space, and a very brief word about some new technologies coming along. So my theme is largely going to be that global strategies are actually local. You need to consider both sides of the story. Heinz, as we can see here, reported by our good friends in the Financial Times, has a global strategy of investing in the emerging markets. And that's fine, that's one strategy for them to follow. But it's resulted in 3 different ways of implementing that strategy in 3 different places. So instead of just, they are pushing into those emerging markets. But that means that they are selling canned vegetables in Russia, soya sauce in Indonesia, and nutritional beverages, whatever they are, in India. So you've got 3 different ways of addressing that single global market. So it's important to understand what's happening locally. And we've had a number of local events that have had an impact on global strategies, on worldwide activities. Just over a year ago, we had that dreadful earthquake and resulting tsunami in Japan. And that had a tremendous impact in a number of different industries. Production lines were affected from Canada to Poland. Components weren't available. All sorts of activities were hit. The failure of the nuclear power plants in Japan meant that power supplies were very badly affected in Japan as they tried to recover. So we had things like liquefied natural gas being diverted into Japan to backfill that energy need, which meant, presumably, that the LGN sources were less available elsewhere. And so you have a knock-on effect of all these activities around the world. Floods in Thailand, that hit a Toyota production line, which meant that they lost, I think, over 300,000 cars. And that meant that those vehicles, they weren't then being shipped anywhere. They weren't being transported. They weren't arriving in the dealerships. So all along that supply chain, you had an impact from that one local event. Regime change in Egypt. There was a lot of political unrest around that area and the Eastern Mediterranean last year. And there was an appliance manufacturer, European appliance manufacturer, was particularly badly hit because they'd chosen to put their one production factory in Egypt. And they lost that completely for a short period. Again, with the resulting knock-on effect of their products not being able to get to market for quite a period. So you have to understand how these different local events have an impact on the businesses that we're all trying to address. So we need to build resilience into those supply chains in order to overcome the impact of these different types of activities that are going on. And we've got things like Nestle, and they're building finishing factories near to where the consumers are in Africa. The African transport network is particularly expensive. So in order to cut down on the different transportation links that need to be used in Africa, they are bussing in bulk loads of something like a paste that's used to create stock cubes. So they ship that in bulk, and they finish that up, they package it, they do all that locally. So they're reducing the amount of money they have to spend on that kind of transportation around and about. So they're actually saving money, as well as having less reliance on a wider transportation network. Saab Miller is introducing cassava into some of its beer recipes in Mozambique. I'm sure the good people of Mozambique think that's great. But it does mean that they are having a greater reliance on local products, rather than having to bus in all of their source ingredients into that one place. So again, building a little bit of resilience into the supply chain as it operates globally. And there's a little remark there from the chairman of Heinz that the emerging markets are providing a huge amount of their revenues, almost a quarter there this last year, compared to just under 20% the year before. So this African business is really very important. The whole consumer products area, for instance, is showing a great deal of growth, and a lot of these companies are very interested in moving into it. The guys at KFC are likening Africa to the next China. And if you think about the consumer goods market, then as soon as economies start to stabilize, as soon as they start to grow a little bit, that's the first thing that people start spending their money on. And so you can see that those guys are thinking that, this is where China was maybe 5 years ago. This is where Africa is now. Is this reasonable? But all the big guys are going in there, largely because you've got that idea, if you're the first guys in there, you become the trusted brand. You become what people remember. And so you're in there for the long run. But what does that mean for the engineering software suppliers? Well, if we look back at that brewery in Mozambique putting cassava into its recipes, well, that's going to mean new processes. It's going to maybe mean new plant. It's going to mean new packaging. It's going to mean that folk in those local EPC companies are going to be using more and possibly different software in order to accommodate this change in the beer recipe that they've got going. But just because the guys in Mozambique are doing something different, that doesn't mean that that's where you're targeting your sales. That doesn't mean that's where the decision is made as to how and what is used to achieve that. Quite often, you're going to get a decision made at the head office rather than at the local factory. We all know that the user is not necessarily the buyer, so you've got that written in spades here. So you have to work out the buying decision is made somewhere else entirely. So that's where the software providers need to start looking for their business development and sales investment. But when it comes to looking at where the sales are, you're going to see the revenue recognized out in the territory. So what you need to do is to be very careful when you're looking at numbers supporting global figures as to what actually you're looking at. What I'm going to be looking at today are the end-user expenditures, which is recorded in the country of the software license transaction. So it's not necessarily where the revenue is recognized by the company selling the product. You might be recognizing that at HQ. But it's more actually about a tax event happening in the local country. And actually what that means is that those values, those figures are actually very reliable and very carefully collected, because there's a tax element involved, obviously. Those guys will always be sure of what they're collecting. So we gather that end-user expenditure figure, and that's what we'll be looking at in the later parts of the presentation. And a quick word about, is Africa the new China when it comes to the engineering side of things? And perhaps it isn't, because another aspect you have to remember is that the African economies are much more varied in their makeup. And there is perhaps a less well-educated workforce out there. It's very mixed, a much more mixed view than you get, say, in China or indeed in India. So whilst the consumer goods folks are maybe seeing, a lot of growth, a lot of similarity between the growth that is happening in Africa at the moment, it's maybe not translating itself across the board just yet. So now I'm going to take a look at some of those technical applications figures that we've gathered up. A quick summary, I'll just build this, of our observatories and the numbers that we're looking at. I'm going to take a look at this end-user expenditure, which I mentioned just then. We gather vendor revenues, we look at regional and segment views of the data, and we manifest those into our industry, employment, country, and product observatories. And we gather that data from these different sources and suppliers. So from national statistics offices, from the IMF, from company filings, from a whole range of different places. And we gather those and calculate from all of that a view on what the engineering software space is. And these are the four areas that I'm going to talk about next. So I'm going to look at some country data, some industry data, some employment data, and a brief look at the systems engineering and embedded software data that we have. And I'm going to do that very excitingly using Google Earth. And I want to thank our friends at Google for giving me a tool to show this data in, which is far more exciting than showing you a spreadsheet or even the endless charts. And there'll be charts later, don't worry. But this is just a really nice way of displaying the data, particularly as it's country-based. Also, a big thanks to the people at the KML Factbook who provide a very simple way of converting a table of data into KML so that it can be presented using Google Earth. And if I just do that. So what we're looking at here is an animation that is showing the growth in the use of technical applications worldwide. So it's a little animation is running there through showing the data from, I put this here, from 2007 through to 2016. So this is lifted out of our country observatory data. And you can see the colours changing, so that's a fairly straightforward thing. It's worth noting that this is more of a heat map if you think of those colours in that term, it's not, red for danger, green for go. It's red is the warm, interesting data that we want to look at here. So where we're looking at the red figures, that's a high growth area. So let me just stop this somewhere interesting. We look at last year's. Okay, so what we're looking at here as the data, as we move through, is we can see how the growth in operational currency is changing over time. So last year, this is what I was trying to get to. So last year, we've got some fairly coolish colours, those tans, orangey colours there, making not a great deal of interest going on. But the hot spot that we can see there is actually Turkey. And I don't suppose anyone perhaps would have thought of that as being the area of highest growth for technical applications last year. But they had 12% growth, according to our figures. You can see Greece there, no surprise at all, at -6, nearly 7% decline there. But Turkey, yeah, who'd have thought it? This little display, by the way, I'll open that up a couple of times as we go through this, and it's just the way that the KML data is presented. You always get the top figure reported and the bottom figure reported, and then the one that you've highlighted is what's turning up in the middle there. So we can see that Turkey is number one. As we move through the animation, though, if we look at, let's go back, say, to 2008, we can see the beginning of the economic crisis there in Europe. UK was doing okay, but Ireland was badly hit. Iceland is badly hit. The European territories, even France was having a difficulty there. They're all showing up quite clearly. But as we move on through the data, we can see, as was said earlier, the recovery is coming through and everything is starting to look a little bit more comfortable. But we're still not seeing a great deal of red on this chart, so if I just whiz round, that's where all the growth is, around here. In the Asia-Pacific region. So that's China, India, and in fact Indonesia. Okay? Well, that would have said that India was number 2, China at number 1, and Indonesia at number 3, in fact, there. So that's where all the growth was happening in 2011. So understanding where the data is, understanding where the growth is happening is obviously crucial to knowing where to invest next. The next data that I'll take a look at actually brings up a question of currency, because when you're looking at market data, particularly on market size, you have to think of what currency is being involved, because there can be quite severe fluctuations depending on what you are looking at. The data I was just showing is in what we term operational currency, and that's the currency that's used locally, and it's the currency that we think reflects the truest view of growth locally, because regardless of where your perspective is, where you're looking from, it's the guys on the ground who are selling, who need the investment in order to grow the business. So the operational currency is whatever the transaction is carried out in. It's usually the local currency. So in the UK, it's British pounds. In Australia, it's the Australian dollar. In the US, it's the US dollar. Occasionally, it's different. In Europe, a lot of the smaller Eastern European countries have softer currencies. And so their transactions are actually carried out in euros, which is fairly usual. So the operational currency there is the euro. In the Far East, a lot of the softer currencies will carry out their transactions in the US dollar. So that's how they're recorded. But typically, it's the local currency. And it does make a big difference. If we take a look at this next data set, what this does is it shows us the impact of looking at growth from the perspective of the dollar. An awful lot of companies do that. They will decide that their global currency is the dollar, and so they will always gather in their regional revenues and data and convert it into the dollar, and that's fine, and that gives you a level playing field. And I can assure you that the Cambashi data is also available in the US dollar, of course, so that you can do like-for-like comparisons. But when you're looking at picking up those local strategies for your businesses, it's worth bearing in mind what difference it can make when you're looking across currencies. So if I just run this animation, you'll see the changes. And what happens here is, if I'm looking at this from the perspective of the US dollar, and I see one of those countries is a sort of grey colour, then there's nothing particularly extraordinary happening from a currency point of view. But if I see blue, well, what's happening there is that in the US dollar, that's a bad number. That's a decline, a negative growth figure. But if I see red, that's a positive growth figure. And it's a change in sign from what the local currency is doing. So there, let me just stop that. Back in 2008, Europe was looking pretty red, which means that from the perspective of the US dollar, that was in growth. Fabulous. But actually, locally, if you look at that in the euro, because that's just about when the crisis really kicked in, they were in decline. And they showed negative growth through that period. You move on a couple of years, and the opposite has happened. So now from the US perspective, the growth is negative. But locally, they're actually starting to come out and show recovery and positive growth when you look at it from the perspective of the euro. So that's just another little hiccup to bear in mind when looking at global figures. If we go round the other side of the world, let me get the right year for this one. There's another interesting artifact here. That's Japan and Vietnam. And what's happening here is that from the perspective of the dollar, Japan is growing and Vietnam is in decline. But in fact, Vietnam's doing pretty well, actually. There is some growth there. But it's in its own currency, or it's in its regional currency. So you've got this strange impact of the currency exchanges depending on where you look. So perhaps looking at an alternative view is to look at the spend per engineer. And this is another way of viewing the market size, which is how much people are spending on their engineering software per user. And what we've got here, let me just get this round a bit. This huge red area here, that's Japan. Let's see if my pop-up's going to work. That's right. Japan is the top spender per engineer on engineering software. $500 a head, approximately. We've taken a value for engineers and technicians and divided that into our figure for engineering software in Japan. So it's a fairly simple calculation made on the two data sets we have. And that's how it breaks down. And that's fine. You know, that's what you would expect, actually. The Japanese are very rigorous about recording the types of occupations and classes that people work in different industries. And also software is expensive in Japan. So that's what you would expect there. The bottom one there, let's just open that again, is actually the Ukraine. Ukraine spending $5 a head. So that's, you know, an interesting effect in itself. I mean, it's not a terribly wealthy country. It's not spending a lot of money. But, you know, it is spending probably more than that per engineer. But then, you know, the way they record their employment stats perhaps is different. And there's a, you know, certain, the pricing is different in that part of the world, and piracy is different in that part of the world. So there's lots of different things to be factored in. Looking at getting back to Europe, we've got a range of different values there. And the sort of thing you can do here, you know, is look at how much people are spending in different territories. Austria, there's $300. I think that's $200 in Germany. And it's the kind of thing you can use maybe to target people with, you know, that's the kind of spending we want people to be making on our software in that sort of area. It's just a different way of measuring and targeting the different market space. The last data set I want to look at is market share. And this very briefly, if I just run this animation, will show us the change in market share around the world. So this is taking the market as being 100%, and then what percentage of that each country is. And if I just step out, I think you can't quite see it. I think you can see the growth there. The big red blob there at the top, that's the US. And the US is more or less the same all the way through, about a quarter of the world. That's really unchanged. The growth is happening out in the Asia area. And you can just see that growing slightly on the eastern edge of that world view. And that growth is all at the expense of Europe. Europe is declining slightly in their market share, and it's all going out to the Asia region. So again, that's just a different way of looking at the data in order to help you pinpoint where to strike next. So back to the slides. So what is it that you need to be looking at, really? Probably less the change in market share, but the actual change in market size, because that's where the real opportunity is going to be. It's less a case of looking at different percentages, because of course a large percentage of a small number is still a small number. But you know, you're going to be able to look at where those changes are. And in our figures, there are 4 countries still holding the top spots, possibly in different orders. That's the US, China, Germany, and Japan. And there's not much surprise there as we look through this year and next year. But in the top 10 in both those years, there are 4 other countries there which are still bobbling around in that top 10 in different positions. India, the UK, South Korea and France. So that's maybe your next set to watch. So a quick view about industries. If your global strategy is going to be focusing on the emerging markets, then China has been the poster boy for the emerging markets for some time. And what we've done here is take an analysis of what end users are spending in different industries on their engineering software. And that is not terribly easy to read. It's considerably easier than if it was the 140-odd industries that we do actually track. We group them up into, there are 11 there, so that it's just a little bit more manageable. The figures for China actually show that the top 2 industries spending are machinery and the telecoms and utilities industry spaces. So that's not perhaps surprising. And you could say that, okay, that's what's happening in China. That's going to be my model for the emerging markets. Let's go with that. But if you look at Vietnam, for instance, that's not necessarily going to work. The same filter on the data shows there that the top 2 industries growing are consumer goods and the automotive space. So even though you're focusing on those emerging markets, you need to take a deeper look, perhaps, at individual countries. A quick look back at the old world, and we have the German market space is different again, with machinery and automotive at the top. And what's interesting there is that even in Germany, the automotive line, which is the second one, the green one there, still isn't quite back to the figure it was at in 2008. So that's pretty. That's a reflection, really, of the situation with the euro and how that impact is still being seen, even in Germany. But back to those emerging markets again, and if we look at Indonesia, a different view again as to what the top 2 industries are that are spending on their figures. There it's telecoms and utilities and AEC, a reflection perhaps of the change in or the development of infrastructure and so on in those areas. So it's important to look beyond the headline, as it were, and take a close look at the detail behind the industries and the different territories when looking at global strategies. So finally, a very quick word about technologies. One of the things that we've been focusing on recently and have discovered quite a lot of growth in is the embedded software space. The smart industries are busily tooling themselves up with very smart devices, and that's bringing a lot of additional challenges for the industries that we're in. People are not just developing their products, but they are now putting a lot more software into them. And that means that the development tools that go along with those not only have to manage development of that embedded software itself, but also coordinating that with the development of the physical product. So how you bring together the whole development process of your physical product with the development of the software product, and keeping those aligned throughout the whole life cycle of that development. And it's a very interesting area that we're looking at the moment, and it is achieving fairly strong double-digit growth this year and next. And just to give a quick view of how that's looking globally, we pitch this market for the tools supporting this development at around 2.3 billion, so that's a lot of market share to go for. But it's split quite evenly around the Americas, APAC, and EMEA regions. So you could say all to play for there. So in conclusion, finally, the growth of that embedded software in our products is bringing out a need for perhaps multidisciplinary development teams, the opportunity for global development teams, really, if you have the tools to support a disjoint development group. You can have one aspect of the engineering design done in the US, you can have ergonomic design done somewhere else, you can have packaging developed elsewhere again. But there are country-level differences always to be considered, tailoring your sales and marketing to the local situation so that you get the best out of that. But it's worth remembering that those emerging markets, which are still growing, are able to jump some of the technology generations. At one point, you could say that the emerging countries were behind the curve because they had no telecoms infrastructure. But they don't necessarily need that. They can jump straight to wireless and, they're away. That can happen in other industries and with other technologies as well. They don't have necessarily to deal with the legacies that are available elsewhere. So that's all I was going to cover today. Thank you very much for your patience and for your time. And I'll take questions and try to answer them if you have any.
Well, first let's give Christine a round of applause. Thank you so much, Christine. Are there any questions? I see a question here. Would you wait for the mic?
I'm George Wang.
Hi.
In the global economy, that the European Central Bank and also the U.S. Treasury is printing a lot of money to dilute the values. What does it do to impact the global industry and the market?
So when the U.S. government is putting more money into the industries, does that impact the market?
It's diluting the value of the dollar or the euros.
Well, that's back to the point about currencies, really. You find that if the dollar is strong, then relatively the euro will look weak. And that you can have one of those flip effects in whether or not an area is growing or in decline, simply because of the way the currency changes. So if you're weakening the strength of the dollar, then the euro will look stronger, and so that will look as though it is growing faster because it's you can buy more dollars with your euro. On the ground, locally, in somewhere like Germany or France, that might not be the case. In Spain or Portugal, that almost certainly isn't the case, that on the ground you can buy more with your euros. So it is something to watch out for when any question of currency comes up.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
So I was just wondering, in the area of embedded software, in terms of the double-digit growth, is there any particular areas that you see the trend being strongest? So, for instance, requirements management, you said systems engineering, software change configuration management. Do you have that data, or? We do have the data back at the office.
Okay.
Okay. We can follow up later.
Yeah, that would be good, actually. I think there's a lot of focus on the testing side of things. So that's likely to be an area of growth. But it would be interesting to check exactly if we can pick out which strand of that is strongest. Yeah.
Any other questions? Well, Christine, thank you again so much.
Thank you.